Is tying humanitarian assistance to human rights the right course for Afghanistan? Aid agencies this week imploring the West, and in particular the U.S. Treasury, to allow money transfers to flow unhindered and to unblock desperately needed funds. And when we say desperate, it is winter, and the United Nations estimates that more than half the population doesn't have enough to eat there. With famine and shuttered healthcare facilities come disease and a spike in epidemics like pneumonia. Are the Taliban fit to govern? Those who fled or are hiding argue not. But then again, what happened during the 2 decades where they were out of power? Afghanistan's grown, but also seems to have grown more dependent on outside assistance. With revenue nosediving now, the country's left with its addiction to remittances and the drug trade. How to change the course, and whose job is it to fix it? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the famine in Afghanistan. Joining us from Washington, Obaidullah Bahir, lecturer in transitional justice at the American University of Kabul. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
He's a former Afghanistan country manager for the World Bank. William Bird is senior analyst at the United States Institute for Peace. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
From Geneva, Matt Reed, Global Director of Institutional Partnerships for the Aga Khan Foundation. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Last December, France 24 reported on a displaced persons camp on the outskirts of Kabul where women were forced to sell their children to survive. In Cadiz, in western Afghanistan, Sky News this week, speaking with desperate families, also forced to sell their kids.
Okay.
That desperate situation that you saw there in Cadiz, Obaidullah Bahir, what right now, and since the last time we spoke, which was at the end of last year, what's changed?
I think things have gone towards being worse. Look, it was obvious from the get-go that aid wasn't going to solve the problem. When you're choking the economy of Afghanistan with sanctions, when you're refusing to allow any sort of capital injection through the Federal Reserves being unfrozen, the situation is just going to keep getting worse and worse. And no sort of aid would solve it, because if the goal is to create parallel structures to the current de facto government in Afghanistan with regards to the service industry and so on and so forth, it hasn't worked elsewhere in the world. It didn't work last time the Taliban were in power. And this is a unique opportunity to try and create something more sustainable within Afghanistan. And of course, that doesn't mean accepting the Taliban at face value right now. There's much that needs to be discussed, but there are better ways to go about it. The discussion shouldn't be between recognition and non-recognition and backbreaking sanctions. There's a huge range of options in between that we need to discuss.
Okay, so it's not binary, and we're going to get to that because that is the heart of the matter there. Let's just remind our viewers, though, last month, former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who's now the World Health Organization Ambassador for Global Health Financing, he launched an appeal for a pledging conference to raise $4.5 billion for Afghanistan. But as the UN Secretary General recently pleaded, there's no point in raising money if world powers won't let the cash in.
We need to suspend the rules and conditions that constrict not only Afghanistan's economy, but our life-saving operations. At this moment of maximum need, these rules must be seriously reviewed. International funding must be allowed to pay the salaries of public sector workers. From surgeons and nurses to teachers, sanitation workers and electricians, all are vital to keeping systems up and running, and they are critical to Afghanistan's future. We need to give them a reason to stay in the country.
Now, in an editorial this week, the Financial Times pointing to $1.2 billion worth of support that's been frozen by the World Bank. The bank and its key sponsors, writes the newspaper, including the U.S., the European Union, and the U.K., have equivocated. It has promised to look at the matter at a board meeting later this month. Delays are no longer tolerable. William Byrd, your thoughts on that?
Well, just to be clear, it's been something like 14 years since I left the World Bank, so I certainly am just speaking in my personal capacity and not on the behalf of the World Bank. There is movement toward getting that $1.2 billion remaining from the trust fund put to use. And it's taking longer than it should, but I think that's in the works. And as the previous guest said, it's not aid alone that will solve the problem. So, this is a dire situation, as you said when you started this segment, and really it needs an all hands on deck response from all sides. And stabilizing the Afghan economy at some point will be really important, even if saving lives right now is the top immediate priority.
So, Matt Reed, just after the fall of Kabul in August, we already were having this discussion. We knew this would come to this. And yet there still are those U.S. Treasury restrictions. They've been eased a little bit so that humanitarian assistance can get in. But everyone's always wary when that happens, because we've seen in other parts of the world how whether or not the rules have been loosened or not is confusing for outside players that don't want to run afoul of the United States on these matters.
I think that's absolutely right. We've been saying from the very beginning that we needed some clear statements around relaxation of the sanctions, or at least clear statements about exemptions. I think to its great credit, actually, the U.S. Treasury came out quite quickly and had a very broad interpretation of humanitarian exemptions and also meeting basic human needs. It's taken several months to get the UN to do that, but they did it in December. The UK and the EU incorporated those into their laws, domestic laws, last week. And then the Treasury has just made some recent, I think, clarifications, making it very clear to banks that they can transfer funds. And I think that's critical, because one of the real challenges is that banks, of course, they look at the sanctions regimes. They have to weigh up the commercial risks of getting involved in a place. There's no commercial interest for them to be involved in Afghanistan right now. And so when they're weighing that versus the possibility of, say, freezing all their dollar transactions if they happened somehow to violate that sanctions regime, it's very hard for a bank to make a decision to take that risk. And so I think the U.S. Treasury clarifications last week, we now have the other exemptions in place, and it's really now up to banks to say, we have a role to play in this situation, and we cannot do that work without them. It's a crucial first step.
A crucial first step, and
our
Matt,
organization is.
Yeah, I was just going to say, a crucial first step, and just to make it clear for our viewers, the U.S. dollar is effectively the world's currency, and the United States has a huge reach around the globe because so many transactions on this planet happen in dollars, and particularly in a place like Afghanistan.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And so, if and most banks have also, they have dollar interest. They have clients who want to bank in dollars. So if for whatever reason they're blocked out of that system, commercially they can't function. And so the risks are, we have to be frank, they're very big for banks. But I think what's very helpful is that now what's clear from the Treasury clarifications last week is that there are no risks. They've said very clearly that commercial banks can facilitate those transactions, and also that in doing that, they can work with Afghan state financial institutions and state private financial institutions. And that's also very important, because banks were quite worried that, well, if they transfer the money in, what does it mean that the money would go, say, through the Afghan central bank at one point? And would there somehow be a kind of infection and let's call it collusion in some way with the Taliban? The new clarifications make it very, very clear that they are allowed to do that to deliver critical humanitarian aid.
So let's, Baidullah Bahir, you're in Washington right now. If you want to wire money back home to loved ones, how does it work?
Look, I'm already leading a food initiative in which we're trying to provide bread for 200 families a day within the province and city of Kabul. So that means they get coupons, they walk to their relevant bakeries, and they get 10 pieces of freshly baked bread every day. And just moving the money is a complete headache. There's so many loopholes to jump across. I tell people that very often when we are getting $3,000 into Afghanistan, by the time it reaches Afghanistan, it's barely $2,600. And that's a crazy amount of overhead that has to be spent on
How does that work exactly?
So basically, the easiest way would be to transfer money through the Hawala system, which is you give money there and a business pays you within Afghanistan. But that itself is a very gray industry that a lot of people don't want to participate in. Then the solution is to move the money through Western Union or any other service to a neighboring country to Afghanistan. And you already lose a lot of money in the exchange rates there. And then you have to pick that money up and either physically move it into Afghanistan or do a Hawala again. But at the end of the day, like I said, you're losing 25% of the money you're trying to bring in
And
through that system.
just to be clear, the easing of the restrictions by the U.S. Treasury, as described there by Matt, have they changed anything?
I think what it has done is help enable aid organizations from the US to be able to provide aid and not have as many obstacles. But at the end of the day, unless there's cash inside Afghanistan, you can't really move money to Afghanistan. So if you wire money through any service that's Western Union or MoneyGram, at the end of the day, you can't even receive that cash. So because they don't have that cash, and then they send it to your bank account, and then bank accounts have restrictions of a specific limit every week. So if you're trying to send in thousands of dollars, that's not the mechanism you're going to use.
The mechanism you're going to use. So a slight easing, but still very complicated. And then there's the question of what happens at the other end. For the second time in 3 months, the country director for the UN Development Program has called out Afghanistan's central bank for blocking money needed for programs and salaries of local staff. The UNDP has some $30 million stuck at the central bank, at AIB, rather, a bank that I cannot convert to Afghanis without, which is the local currency. Without Afghanis, as you can imagine, we cannot implement all our programs, says that UNDP chief Abdallah al-Dardari, who back in November told Reuters of Afghanistan's cash crunch, $4 billion worth of Afghanis in the economy, but only $500 million worth in circulation. Not enough bills, not enough coins. The Afghan central bank responding to his latest complaint with a blanket denial, saying that the Bank of Afghanistan has sufficient Afghani cash reserves and has responded positively to every demand in this regard. And there are no concerns noticed in regard to the Afghani liquidity so far in the 34 provinces of this country. Brilliant Bird, your reaction to that tiff between that very important United Nations agency and the central bank in Afghanistan?
Well, I'm not sure. I think it may be making a mountain out of a molehill. I think there is a shortage of Afghani currency, but since this represents the cash US dollars that were shipped in at high cost by Money Corps on behalf of UN agencies, there's no reason why those cash dollars can't be withdrawn from the banks in the form of dollars and used for payments. Now, there is a slight problem for some very small payments because obviously, the U.S. cash is in high denomination bills, so that could be an issue for small payments. But if others would know better than I do, but if you're paying an Afghan household of, say, 7, 8, 10 or more people $100 for a month of subsistence and income support, I think that might be well in line. So I don't see the problem. If the Taliban are not allowing dollars to be withdrawn from dollar-denominated accounts, that is on them and is a very counterproductive policy, which urgently needs to be changed.
Well,
I think it's more an issue of the smaller denominations rather than an issue of liquidity. Now, quickly on the Afghani banknotes, this is something that the government of France really could get involved in because, as far as I understand, it's a French company with a printing press in Poland, and they're concerned and scared rightly about the sanctions. And if they got reassurances from the French government, they might be more willing to print more Afghanis, and also, of course, getting reassurances from the U.S., which I believe has already been in contact with the company.
Gosh,
So,
let me just get Matt Reed's reaction on this, because I mean, just to make it clear again for our viewers, we're talking about a nation's banknotes that have to be printed outside of the country, and in this particular case, they hesitate as to whether or not to send them to Afghanistan.
Well, sure. I mean, there are some people have raised questions about if you were to say flood the economy with banknotes, it might lead to inflation, et cetera. I think the key thing to understand is what the UNDP representative said in his statements to Reuters and others. You know, you've got 4 billion Afghani that are out there, only 500 million in circulation. It's not enough. And so we do need efforts to try to bring some of that liquidity into circulation. I think the really important thing, though, is to actually make some of these macro changes, both through sanctions, get some banks making transfers to the country, regularize some of the international transactions that existed and that are perfectly okay now under the sanctions regimes, so that you can build some confidence in the banking system. The real problem is that people are not depositing the banknotes that they have into the system because, as our other panelists talked about, there are currency controls. You can't withdraw money from banks. So you have a couple of things that could be done inside the country to build a bit of confidence in the banking system and then allow the economy to function a little bit more normally. Now, I should say, one of the other things, as to what William was saying, we've, for essentially 4 months, our organization, the Aga Khan Development Network, which is one of, next to the UN, largest set of development agencies in the country with 10,000 employees, we could not transfer any money into the country, virtually none. That means that our staff have not been properly paid in 4 months, etc. Just last week, we were able to open a banking channel through Crown Agents Bank in the UK, which to his great credit has understood that there is a wide lane under the current sanctions exemptions. So we're now getting money into the country. We think about 2/3 of our payments can be made bank to bank, so you don't actually have to withdraw them. So just even making some of those wire transfers and those bank-to-bank transactions could get something back to a little bit more normality.
And on that point,
again, as I said earlier, these are critical first steps.
And on the point that was raised at the outset by Obaidullah Bahir about whether or not you can set up quote unquote parallel structures, that is to say, try and isolate the Taliban as much as possible, but at the same time bring money in. I know it's something that the international community is grappling with when it comes to Myanmar and trying to bypass the junta there. With Afghanistan, is it possible?
Well, wait, who's the question directed?
Well,
I'll put it to Matt Reed first.
It's absolutely possible to work in Afghanistan in a way where aid money doesn't have to go through the state. We've already seen it in something called the Sahet Mandi program, which is essentially where the previous government of Afghanistan had outsourced, if you will, the provision of health care in many of the provinces. Our network does that, where basically we run the health program on behalf of the government. We pay salaries through that. We purchase things through that. It is perfectly possible for that money to go directly through organizations like ours and then on to pay doctors, nurses, etc. There are ways to do that, even around the education system. UNICEF is looking into it, and it's absolutely possible and plausible.
Obaidullah Bahir?
Yeah, so a few things that I want to highlight. There's a discussion going on and gaining traction with regards to the recognition of the Taliban. If you look at a few statements from the UK and so on and so forth, I think recognition itself is a very strong leverage the international community has, which shouldn't be wasted. I think it sets a very bad precedent if the international community is willing to recognize the Taliban at the current face value and after overthrowing a democratically elected regime. That being said, I don't think the solution is non-engagement or working around the Taliban. And I say that for a few reasons, because if you notice the discussion that we just had about the money and moving it in, it's a very typical example of how aid isn't the solution unless there is actual cash within the economy and there is some sort of movement. Nothing can come out of it. But it's really problematic when you refuse to engage and try to build another aid model. I mean, the failure of the previous republic was its crazy amounts of aid dependency, one. And number two, there's very often going to be gaps that are missed by the international community that the government, de facto government, can address. And lastly, there's always going to be overlap. For example, if you've seen the latest USIP report, it says that the Taliban are generating national revenue, but what are they spending it on? And what then should the aid money be spent on with regards to the services being provided by the government? So for all of that discussion to happen, I mean, yes, don't give the money a blank check to the Taliban and expect them to do right by it. But there are ways of trying to use this as an opportunity of teaching the Taliban how to govern whilst keeping strict monitoring bodies in place to make sure that the money isn't abused and that power doesn't go to waste. So there are ways to go about it. It's just that we have to be creative because this is a very new problem.
A very new problem. So how do you engage without full recognition? We're joined by Afghan journalist Aman Farong, former reporter for One TV News. Thanks for being with us here in the studios in Paris. Do you agree with what you just heard from Abaidullah, that no engagement with the Taliban is not the solution either?
So yeah, we think there is no time for recognition of Taliban government. This is not a government. This is a terrorist group that they are in Afghanistan. There are more than 35 million Afghans that are suffering from Taliban. So they're killing the people, they're killing the women, so they're killing the journalists. There is nothing in Afghanistan. Just Taliban come by help of the Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan, and US support the Taliban by agreement in Doha. But this is make the Taliban to come by military.
But then there's the reality on the ground right now, which is
this
people.
Is the reality, but
the reality on the ground is people are hungry.
Yes.
And they need food. So
But
how do you go about it?
So Taliban abusing from this situation. Taliban don't think about the situation of Afghan people. They are more than 93% of the people of Afghanistan are lower poverty line in Afghanistan, and more than 90% of health clinic in Afghanistan is closed because of lack of fan and medical.
So what do? Do you bring in the international community again?
Yeah. The Afghan people needs to help by international community, but it's important how they can help. So, the UN sent money in Afghanistan, but it still is in an international bank, but they can spend that and can help that. But they sent a lot of help in Afghanistan, but Taliban gave this money and this food for their relation, the people that support the Taliban in north of Afghanistan, in center of Afghanistan, in Badakhshan, Daikundi, in Bamiyan. Those people are very, very in bad situation, but the Taliban then gave them money or then gave them medicine. They don't give anything. But the Taliban asked all the people that they are support the Taliban and their military.
Let me bring in William Bird. What do you do then? Is it possible, again, this concept that we were talking about parallel structures, is it possible to have parallel structures, or do you have to deal with the Taliban?
I think there's a need for some engagement with the Taliban. I absolutely agree that it's would be very premature to engage in recognition. Even Pakistan, which supported the Taliban for nearly 30 years by now and was their sponsor for over these many years, has not yet recognized the Taliban, which shows, I think, shows something. So I think recognition is not something I look at as one of the options. But there is a need for engagement. In the USIP paper that the other panelists kindly referred to, which I wrote, the Taliban have a budget which includes teacher salaries, yet internationals are all over the place talking about paying teacher salaries. So that needs to be sorted out, right? You don't want double payments. You don't want, if the international community pays for the teacher salaries, then the Taliban budget resources are freed up to use for other purposes, such as justice, security, prisons, or something like that. So the general point is you need enough engagement, and the World Bank would be the obvious candidate to engage non-financially with the government, so that there's a better understanding of both the central bank, the banking system issues, and the Taliban resources. They raised some 400 million in taxes in the last quarter. Final point, I would really like to stress that this has to be seen as a risk management issue. The idea that somehow food aid, physical food aid, which is the most humanitarian of all humanitarian aid, is not being diverted or misused or in some way benefiting the Taliban is wrong. So the idea that somehow you can insulate everything from the Taliban is simply way off. And you need to weigh different options which carry different risks and different benefits. For example, maybe it's quite possible that some forms of mobile phone accounts and liquidity in that way would actually be less vulnerable to diversion by the Taliban than the physical food aid. I'm just giving that as an example, but I've all along stressed the need for a risk management approach versus a zero tolerance approach, which is completely unrealistic when you're talking about $4 billion.
It's an important example because, and I'll put it to Matt Reed, again, I come back to the example of Myanmar, where money transfers with mobile phones are proving an important source for those who want to bypass the system in that standoff there with the junta. Is that a viable way? Is that something the Aga Khan Foundation looks at?
Absolutely. I mean, our network actually owns one of the largest telecoms companies in the country called Roshan Telecommunications. It introduced something called M-Pesa, which is based on the M-Pesa mobile money transfer system that was originally piloted in Kenya. Afghanistan, in our program, was the second country in the world to introduce it. It's been in existence since 2008. That's a platform that's being used now. One of the challenges right now is linked to liquidity. So, part of the challenge is that you might be able to transfer things mobile to mobile, but then how do you cash out? And so in really remote areas, they do need they do need access to that. But there's a way actually to deal with that. I mean, we could, for example, using development assistance and humanitarian aid, you can increase the number of cash points. You can increase the number of cash agents. You can help facilitate access to mobile accounts and to these M-Pesa accounts. It's absolutely something that we can and should be looking at in Afghanistan to help facilitate some of this aid.
All right. And of course, there is, at a time when the economy has grounded to much of a halt, one source of income that remains opium. We can show you images filmed this past week by Italian television La Rai in the Maiwan district of southern Kandahar province. You want to stop the opium trade? Give us an alternative. That was effectively the message given by Taliban authorities when Sonia Ghazali and Shezep Wala visited the Pul-i-Sokta neighborhood of Kabul for France 24.
At nightfall, these Taliban fighters turned policemen are on a hunt. They are looking for drug addicts who roam the streets of the capital city. At least 4 million people, or nearly 10% of the country's population, is addicted to drugs.
We are saving them from drugs and guiding them back to the right path, to give them a good life in society, because it is our responsibility as a new government.
Tonight, in front of our cameras, they don't find any.
By the grace of God, we've cleaned up this area by arresting all the drug dealers. You were with us on this patrol. Did you see one addict? There are none.
Since they took power, the Taliban claim to have immensely improved the security situation in the cities. However, a violent operation by another patrol aims to chase the drug addicts away. A civilian present at the scene filmed it on a smartphone. The violent eviction methods do not prevent the addicts from coming back the next morning. This vacant land in western Kabul is one of the headquarters of the drug dealers. According to these drug addicts, violence against them has escalated since the arrival of the Taliban.
The Taliban often come here with sticks to hit us to scare us. Every time we run away, but sometimes they shoot us with their Kalashnikovs.
These men live in inhuman conditions in the middle of the sewage. A number of drug addicts die here every month and are buried in the mud.
When we find them, their face is covered in bees, even in their nose. The last man who died, we covered his face with a cloth to chase them away. But despite that, the bees continued to stick to his face. We had to bury him quickly.
The drug abuse is nothing new in Afghanistan, and none of the previous government has succeeded in stopping it. In the previous Taliban regime from 1996 to 2001, the fundamentalist group had almost eliminated the production of opium. But now, Afghanistan represents 85% of the world's production. Today, the Taliban are more ambiguous. The Ministry of Promotion of Virtue and Repression of Vice has published a strict code of conduct.
د هر ډول نشي توکو لکه چارس تریاک پودر او داسې نور هغه معتادین چې په څرګند ډول استعمالوي منع کړي.
But the Taliban leadership makes clear that they would only put an end to the production of opium under certain conditions.
Last year, our leaders issued an order that the Taliban are not allowed to interfere in their affairs. If the international community recognizes us, we will ban the planting of these substances as the way it was before 2001.
When they do not end up in beatings, the raids carried out by the Taliban also lead to imprisonments, or more rarely to forced rehabilitation, as in this rehab center where places are already scarce.
د پودر تقریبا دغه د 8 کاله کېږي چې پودر وهمه او د هغه نه 2 کاله مخکې مې هغه شروع کړل چې د ژوند مې کله چې د اقتصاد مې خراب شو تریاک مې شروع کړل 2 کاله مې تریاک شروع کړل بعد هغه نه 2 کاله نور مې پودر شروع کړل.
ته دلته راغلی دې شفاخانې ته په خپله خوښه باندې راغللی
ژوند نه ډېر د حد نه زیات خوشحاله یم ولې چې استاد محترمه د دې خاطر د خپل ژوند نه اوس خوشحاله یم چې ما تاسو ته وویلې چې د ما پوه شوې اقتصاد بیخي فیل شوی و.
Following the recent Taliban takeover, Washington froze the reserves of the Afghan central bank, an amount close to $10 billion. Since development aid is blocked, the center has been financially strangled.
If we don't get any support from the international community, everything will come to a stop. This is almost already the case. Our activities have been reduced by 70%. If the money does not come in, this center will automatically close.
According to the UN, in the coming months, 97% of Afghans could fall below the poverty line. Faced with international isolation and an economic collapse, it is unlikely that the Taliban will be able to follow through on its promise of drug eradication.
Abdullah Bahir, your reaction when you heard that representative from the Ministry of Virtue say, if the international community recognizes us, we will stop the poppy growing?
I mean, many promises have been made before. And going back to the point of recognition, I mean, the Taliban need to stop seeking it from the international community and need to find some sort of internal legitimacy first, unless the Afghan's people's will can be reflected in who leads the country. We doubt the international community would be too interested in recognition. With regards to the opium and drug trade, the Taliban, unfortunately, were a fundamental part of its existence. The fact that they relied heavily on the drug trade, almost $0.6 billion of their annual fighting budget used to come out of it. Means that they will have a difficult time dealing with the industry now. And some of it is their fault. The other problem is, what is then the alternative? And there are alternatives out there. And we did previously discuss ideas such as hemp being grown within Afghanistan because of how fertile the land is for it and how many different products can come out of it. So we are trying to work on projects with regards to hemp and producing hemp flour and seeing if we can make that a more national thing, create a market for it, and hoping that the Taliban have a sense of not just banning opium, but actually introducing an alternative for it for the citizens, because the NATO tried and they failed in the past 20 years to find an alternative or anything sustainable to ban the narcotic. But let's hope that there are good alternatives that can be presented to the Taliban and they can have a sense of going through with it.
William Burt, for 2 decades, this discussion has been happening. What's the alternative? How do you develop the alternative? Why has it not happened?
As we've said, this has been going on for 2 decades, minus the 1 year the Taliban had a remarkably effective opium planting ban. And that was politically probably the worst mistake that the 1990s Taliban regime made, because it very much undermined their support in certain areas and then facilitated or at least facilitated or eased the remarkably surprisingly easy victory over the Taliban in 2001. So questions about whether that's politically a smart move, but more important, in the current situation, when you've lost the equivalent of 40% of GDP in aid, do you also want to attack the most, one of the most biggest employment provider in rural areas of Afghanistan? I think the answer is no. This should be off the table in the short run. Of course, in the long run, you need development, you need alternatives. You need neighboring countries to get involved. The opium goes somewhere, right? It goes through Pakistan, through the northern borders, and through Iran. So there needs to be a more unified approach. But simply trying to get out of it when for 20 years the international community could not do so, even during a time when there was plenty of aid going into the country and also economic growth generally was pretty good, it's really unrealistic to think about taking major measures in the current situation, and I suspect the Taliban will be smart enough not to do much on that. They really lost out because they did impose an effective ban in the year 2000. They were still not recognized by the UN, and they didn't get any other benefits from it. And in fact, it weakened them in advance of the 2001 international intervention after 9/11.
And since 2001, Aman Farang, we've seen, and we talked about it earlier during this discussion, this increase in international aid. And now with the international community gone, we realize it was, to quote Obaidullah speaking earlier, an overdependence on that international aid. How do you get Afghanistan back on its feet without being overdependent on international aid in the future?
So unfortunately, in 2 decades, all the international community, all the countries that came to Afghanistan, that we fight against terrorism. But unfortunately, all the international community, all the countries that come to Afghanistan, they leave Afghanistan, Afghan people alone. Now it's very difficult that to say that, come help Afghan people. So Taliban come by the help of US and ex-government. You know that US had a very long negotiation in Doha with Taliban, and they accept the Taliban as a government. You know that in in February of 2020, they had an agreement, and Taliban come by that agreement in Afghanistan. Now we cannot say that why the US cannot come to Afghanistan, but if the international community wants to come to Afghanistan, if they wants to help Afghan people, it's easy. They need to force on Taliban. It's very clear message from Afghan people that the Taliban is not acceptable for Afghan people. Now the Afghan people want to come to help Afghan people.
Are the Taliban of 2022 the same as the Taliban that were forced out in 2001, or have they changed?
Now, on that time, now Taliban is very, very, I think that it's not changed. It's changed that killing for people. Now, on that time, now the people cannot go to the school, the girl cannot go to a school, the woman cannot go outside, and there is nothing. And just Taliban come from one nation in Afghanistan. There is not majority and a minority of people. There is many group of people that they are not in government. Just Taliban come, and there is about 30,000 of people. They just now in Afghanistan that more than 30 million people, they don't accept the Taliban.
Right, they're ruling, but they're not governing, is what you're saying. Nonetheless, speaking to the BBC, the former head of British NATO forces in Afghanistan says it's time to face reality. Quote, I think the West is going to end up recognizing the Taliban government. If that's the case, we'd better get on with it quicker, sooner rather than later. There's a great phrase, to be magnanimous in victory. I think this is an occasion for us to be magnanimous in defeat. Matt Reed, is that just where history is going right now?
Well, I mean, we're a neutral, apolitical organization that are there for the people of Afghanistan. That's why we've been in the country for over 2 decades. We started when the Taliban was last in power, and we've remained ever since. So it's not really for me to pronounce on whether or not they should be recognized or not. They are the authorities that are there. In order to work for the people of Afghanistan, you have to work with them and you have to coordinate them. So in that sense, we do have to accept that reality if we want to stop enormous human suffering. I do want to say that, I think it's inaccurate to say, for example, that no girls are going to school in Afghanistan and that there's no opportunities still on the ground in Afghanistan. It is a very different situation across the country. You might even say there are, so that the way that, things that are happening in Kandahar are very different than the way they're happening in Faizabad or, up in Kunduz or Takkar or Badakhshan. And so I think it's really important to understand that there's a lot of room for local variation and local negotiation and engagement. I mean, one of the things that we do is we work with local communities who articulate their concerns, and they go to the new authorities, just like they went to the previous government, or they went to call it the shadow authorities previously. And those communities themselves say, these are things that are important to us. We want our girls in school. We want, roads, irrigation, etc. And they're able to negotiate for themselves. I think it's important as an international community that we support them in doing that because there is space for it.
Space for it. That'll be the final word for now. I want to thank you so much, Matt Reed, for joining us from Geneva. I want to thank William Bird and Obaidullah Bahir in Washington. Aman Farang, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.